Welcome to Life Stories. Today, we have a powerful story about Madison Walker, a young woman born into wealth and privilege who learns the hard way that no amount of money can shield her from the consequences of her actions. After a reckless driving incident that nearly caused a tragedy, Madison finds herself facing a courtroom where her entitlement is put to the test. What follows is a journey of accountability, humility, and self-discovery, as she learns profound lessons about life, respect, and responsibility. Join us as we share this life-changing story. Subscribe now to start today's story. Madison Walker was never the type to be intimidated by anything. She was used to getting her way, used to being in control, and most importantly, used to the world bending to her will. The courthouse that morning, however, was a stark reminder that not everything could be bought with a check. As she strutted down the hallway, her high heels clicking sharply on the polished floor, she radiated the kind of confidence most people only dreamed of. Her fuchsia designer suit hugged her body perfectly, the material shimmering slightly under the harsh fluorescent lights. Sparkling jewelry adorned her neck and wrists, catching the eye of everyone around her. If it weren't for the seriousness of the occasion, Madison could have easily been mistaken for someone walking the runway at a high-profile fashion show. But Madison wasn't at a fashion show. She was at a courthouse, facing charges for reckless driving. A week ago, in her sleek red sports car, she had been speeding through a quiet residential neighborhood, her tires screeching as she barely missed hitting a child who had crossed the street. In the aftermath of the incident, a minor collision with another vehicle had followed. Yet, instead of showing any remorse, Madison had done the unthinkable. She had blamed the other driver, even dismissing the child's close call as just an unfortunate inconvenience. "I can't believe I have to be here," Madison muttered to her assistant, who was trailing behind her, looking a little more stressed than she was. The assistant, a young woman named Jenna, was holding a small dog in a matching designer bag, her eyes flickering nervously as she kept pace with Madison's long strides. Madison tossed her head back, an exaggerated sigh escaping her lips as she glanced at her assistant. "Honestly, all I did was drive a little fast. People act like I committed a crime or something." Her words hung in the air, dripping with disdain for the whole process. As they neared the courtroom doors, Madison glanced around at the onlookers. She was used to the attention, but the whispers she overheard stung. People were staring at her, judging her, but none of that seemed to matter. To her, the situation was more of an annoyance than a serious legal matter. Her father would take care of everything, as he always did. She made her way through the crowd, ignoring the murmurs around her. Some people shook their heads, whispering about her arrogance, while others exchanged knowing looks. But Madison was too caught up in her own world to notice. Or perhaps she simply didn't care. She was too busy wondering how much longer this would drag on, already imagining the lavish lunch she would treat herself to once this ridiculous hearing was over. As the doors to the courtroom opened, Madison stepped inside, her heels clicking on the floor like the sound of a ticking clock. The room was full, with every seat occupied, but Madison barely seemed to notice. She took in the scene with the same detached expression she'd worn on her way in, her oversized sunglasses perched atop her head, her lips pursed in a subtle pout. Some people glanced at her, eyebrows raised at the sight of her flashy outfit, while others shot her annoyed glances, disapproving of her lack of respect for the solemnity of the courtroom. Madison, however, remained unfazed. She walked to the front of the room and chose a seat, plopping down in it with the air of someone who had all the time in the world. Without a second thought, she pulled out her phone and began scrolling through social media, completely disregarding the atmosphere around her. Her lawyer, a man in his late 40s, leaned over and whispered urgently, trying to get her to pay attention. "Madison, please," he murmured, "you need to behave appropriately. This could get worse for you." Madison waved him off dismissively, rolling her eyes as she replied, "Relax, Daddy's got this," her voice dripping with assurance. A smirk played on her lips as she pictured herself sitting at a cafe, sipping a cocktail and laughing about how ridiculous this all was. Her belief that her father's wealth would fix everything was as firm as ever. She wasn't prepared for the storm that was about to brew, though. As the minutes ticked by, Madison's casual attitude began to rub people the wrong way. The other defendants in the room exchanged uncomfortable glances, and even her lawyer looked visibly distressed by her behavior. But Madison was lost in her own little world, too engrossed in her phone to care. Then, the moment came when the judge, a tall and dignified man named Judge Thompson, walked into the room. His gaze immediately landed on Madison, sharp and piercing, as he took his seat at the bench. His presence commanded attention, and though he hadn't spoken a word yet, his stern posture alone was enough to make even the most seasoned defendants nervous. But Madison, true to form, hardly seemed to notice. She continued to scroll through her phone, chewing gum loudly and laughing at something she found amusing. The murmurs of disapproval from the crowd only seemed to fuel her arrogance. Judge Thompson, however, was not the type to tolerate such behavior. His experience with entitled defendants was vast. But Madison's blatant disrespect was something else entirely. He raised an eyebrow, his gaze never leaving her as he began the session. "Miss Walker, please take a seat." His voice was firm, but calm. Madison merely muttered an insincere response as she finally lowered her phone and sat back in her chair. She was still chewing gum. Still defiant. Still unbothered. What she didn't understand was that the gravity of the situation, the potential consequences of her actions, had finally caught up to her. Madison's indifferent attitude persisted throughout the proceedings. As the charges were read aloud, her disinterest was almost palpable. She let out a quiet, almost mocking laugh as the seriousness of her actions was outlined. It seemed to her that the entire situation was beneath her, an unfortunate bump in the road that could easily be smoothed over with a few well-placed calls. She shifted in her seat, pulling out her phone again, her eyes glued to the screen. It wasn't that she was being overtly defiant, it was simply that the courtroom, with its sober air of seriousness, felt like a world she had no intention of participating in. Her lawyer whispered once again, his voice a mix of urgency and embarrassment. "Madison, please. You need to take this seriously. You're giving the wrong impression." Madison, without missing a beat, waved her hand dismissively, almost as if brushing him off like an insignificant fly. "Relax. I've got it handled. Everything will be fine," she said in the same nonchalant tone, leaning back in her chair and crossing one leg over the other as though she were lounging on a beach rather than sitting in a courtroom where her future was being decided. Judge Thompson, who had been patiently watching Madison, could feel his patience wearing thin. He had dealt with entitled defendants before, but Madison's behavior was almost an insult to the very idea of justice. His stern gaze never left her, but he continued with the proceedings, maintaining his calm and measured demeanor. He was a man of principle, and he was beginning to realize that Madison needed more than just a lesson in humility. She needed to understand the real-world consequences of her actions. When it was finally time for Madison to speak, Judge Thompson called upon her. "Miss Walker, do you have anything to say in your defense?" Madison straightened up in her chair, smoothing down the front of her fuchsia suit, as though preparing for an audition rather than addressing the court. She had a smirk on her face, the same one she wore when she was confident that she could talk her way out of anything. "Honestly, I don't even know why I'm here," she said with an exaggerated sigh, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "It's not like anyone got hurt. Can't we just write a check and call it a day?" The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. There was a collective gasp as people exchanged shocked looks. Some were horrified by her lack of empathy, while others were simply disgusted by her flippant attitude. Madison's lawyer buried his face in his hands, utterly mortified by her words. Judge Thompson's expression hardened, but he remained calm, his voice steady when he responded. "Miss Walker," he said, his tone measured, "this is a court of law, not a place for flaunting your privilege. I suggest you take this matter seriously." His words, though calm, were laced with an unmistakable edge of warning. But Madison was unperturbed. "Oh, come on," she scoffed, leaning back in her chair again. "Let's not act like this is some huge deal. Honestly, Judge, shouldn't you understand the importance of knowing your place? Isn't that your job?" The condescending tone in her voice was clear, and the room held its breath, awaiting the judge's response. Judge Thompson's eyes narrowed slightly, But he didn't rise to her bait. His demeanor remained composed, but his voice dropped a few degrees in warmth. "Miss Walker," he said evenly, "you are dangerously close to making this worse for yourself. I suggest you sit down and remain silent while I deliberate." Madison huffed dramatically, slumping further into her chair. She crossed her arms in front of her chest and pouted, still oblivious to the growing tension in the room. She had no idea that she was pushing the limits of the judge's patience. Her behavior, her refusal to take the charges seriously, was about to backfire in ways she couldn't even begin to comprehend. Judge Thompson paused, letting the weight of the silence settle around them. His eyes flicked from Madison to the other people in the room. He could feel their disapproval and frustration, and he knew that something had to be done. Justice was not something that could be bought or ignored. It was a principle, and Madison needed to learn that. With a slow, deliberate motion, Judge Thompson began to speak again. His voice was calm but carried the gravity of his words. "Miss Walker, your actions have shown a blatant disregard for the law. You have demonstrated a troubling lack of accountability for the consequences of your behavior." His gaze locked onto hers, steady and unyielding. "And your attitude here today only reinforces that." Madison's confident posture faltered for just a moment. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, though she quickly masked it with a dismissive chuckle. "Wait, what?" she stammered, not fully understanding the seriousness of the judge's words. "I mean, I said I was sorry, kind of. Reckless driving is not a trivial matter." "Miss Walker," Judge Thompson interrupted firmly, "it is a choice that endangered lives. Your attitude today demonstrates that you do not take these charges seriously. But you will now learn the consequences of your actions." For the first time, Madison felt a shiver of unease crawl up her spine. Something was different now. The way the judge spoke, his words were sharp, deliberate, made her realize that this wasn't going to be a simple fix. The words that followed from Judge Thompson were like a punch to Madison's gut. She wasn't prepared for this. No, she had expected something much simpler. Something her father could handle with a quick phone call or an expensive settlement. She had never even considered the possibility that she might be held accountable for her actions. But now, as the judge's voice cut through the tension in the room, she began to understand just how wrong she had been. "Miss Walker," Judge Thompson began, his voice unwavering, "for your reckless driving, you are hereby fined $50,000. The courtroom fell silent, and Madison's heart skipped a beat. $50,000. The amount was staggering, and her mind raced to think of ways she could pay it off. But there was no escaping the cold reality of the situation. This wasn't something that could be brushed aside. This wasn't something her father could erase with a swipe of his credit card. "50,000? Madison blurted out, her voice rising with disbelief. "Are you kidding me? That's..." She stopped mid-sentence as she saw the unyielding expression on the judge's face. He wasn't joking, and there was no room for negotiation. Her jaw dropped, and for the first time in her life, she felt a pang of fear. This wasn't just a fine, it was a wake-up call. A reminder that she wasn't untouchable. Judge Thompson's gaze never left her. "This amount," he continued, "is not only to cover the damages you caused but also to serve as a deterrent for future behavior. Your actions have consequences, Miss Walker, and you will learn to take responsibility for them." Madison's mind was racing. She had always been able to buy her way out of problems. But this was different. She could feel the weight of the room pressing down on her. Every eye on her as they awaited her reaction. Her father's wealth meant nothing here. It was a sobering realization. But Judge Thompson wasn't done. "Furthermore," he said, his tone cold and deliberate, "you will complete 300 hours of community service, focusing on road safety education. And finally, you will serve 6 months in county jail." The gasps in the courtroom were audible. Madison froze, unable to fully process what the judge had just said. 6 months in jail. The words echoed in her mind, and she could hardly breathe. It was as though the world had suddenly turned upside down. Jail? Her? She could hardly fathom it. She had never spent a night away from her cushioned life. Never faced a consequence that couldn't be undone by money or influence. 6 months? She stammered, her voice laced with panic. "But my dad, He can take care of this. Please, just let me pay the fine. And we'll call it even. Her words tumbled out in a desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. But the judge's expression remained impassive. Your father cannot buy your way out of this. Miss Walker, Judge Thompson interjected firmly, this sentence is not about punishment alone. It is about ensuring you learn the value of accountability and respect for the law. His words hit her like a slap in the face. For the first time, Madison realized that no amount of money could protect her from the consequences of her reckless choices. As the reality of her situation began to sink in, Madison's confident demeanor shattered, her body stiffened, her breathing shallow as the gravity of the moment overwhelmed her. Her mind raced, trying to think of a way out. But there was nothing, no quick fix, no escape. Her father's influence couldn't reach inside the walls of a courtroom. And certainly not behind the bars of a jail cell. The courtroom erupted in whispers. The shock of the sentence rippling through the room. Madison's lawyer, who had been so sure that he could smooth things over, sat in stunned silence, his head bowed in defeat. He knew there was no way out of this one. The judge had made his decision. And there was no changing it. Madison was escorted out of the courtroom, her steps faltering as the weight of the moment settled in. She had no words, no defense left to offer. Her once unshakable confidence had been replaced by a deep, gnawing uncertainty. She had never imagined that the consequences of her actions could be so severe. And now, with the cold air of the courthouse closing in around her, she could no longer deny the truth. She was going to jail. As the guards led her out of the room, Madison couldn't help but glance around one last time. She saw the disapproving faces of the people in the audience. The same people she had once dismissed as beneath her. They were watching her now. And she knew that this moment would define her forever. The life she had known was slipping away. And she had no idea how to hold on to it. Her world had been built on a foundation of wealth and privilege. But now, that foundation was crumbling beneath her feet. Her time in jail would be a rude awakening. And as the doors closed behind her, she knew her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. Madison's time in jail was nothing short of transformative. At first, she fought the experience every step of the way. She complained about the food, the accommodations, and the guards, her mind constantly searching for a way out. But as the days turned into weeks, something shifted inside her. She began to listen to the stories of the other inmates, to their struggles, to their pain. Many of them had faced hardships she couldn't even begin to imagine. And they were paying the price for choices they had made. Just like her. Through her community service, she met families who had lost loved ones due to reckless driving. Their stories hit her like a tidal wave. The pain in their voices, the emptiness in their eyes, she couldn't ignore it any longer. Madison began to understand the impact of her actions. The consequences that extended far beyond her own life. For the first time, she felt empathy, and with it, a growing sense of accountability. By the time her sentence was over, Madison was a changed woman. She had learned the hard way that entitlement could only take her so far. The world didn't revolve around her, and she couldn't buy her way out of everything. But more importantly, she had learned the value of humility, responsibility, and respect, lessons she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Judge Thompson's decision had sent a powerful message, one that Madison would never forget. Justice wasn't for sale. It was a principle, a truth that applied to everyone, no matter who they were or how much money they had. If you've enjoyed this story and want to hear more real-life lessons, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for new videos every week.